this morning begins the story of some who chose to walk with God, to walk with Jesus and the path that they would take. It comes to us from Matthew, the 4th chapter. Just a few short verses. I'll read those words in yellow and invite you to read out together the words in white. As Jesus was walking beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon, called Peter, and his brother Andrew. They were casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen.
Come, follow me, Jesus said, and I will send you out to fish for people.
And once they left their nets and followed him. Going on from there, he saw two other brothers, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John. They were in a boat with their father Zebedee, preparing their nets. Jesus called them.
And immediately they left the boat and their father and followed him.
I recall being in a Catholic elementary school. I was actually in several, but this one was, at the time, the Old Cathedral parochial school there, right next to the high school, and then stands across the street from the church. 3rd or 4th grade classes were so small, we had 3rd and 4th in the same room with the same teacher who alternated between us. And because it was a parochial school, it wasn't unusual for us to start with prayer. And on occasion, the teacher asking for prayer requests from the students. There was one young guy who on a regular basis asked for prayers that his father would catch fish that day. I don't know whether we thought much of it either way, but I suppose it sounded kind of superfluous until one day the teacher explained to us, well, I just want you to know that Kyle's father fishes for a living. It's how he earns money to raise his family, and somehow it meant something to us. He's not just a guy out on the weekend, although that's okay too. But this was his life. This is how he was a father to his children, a husband to his wife. It's what these guys were involved in. Not just a hobby, not just recreation, they were part of the family business. Brothers to the same father, working alongside him, possibly on that verge of the transition between working for Dad and taking over for Dad. This was serious business. This was not just, I'm going to quit fishing and go watch the ball game. This was walking away from your life. This was walking away from your responsibility to your family. This was not something Dad would have enjoyed at all. And while it may have appeared at first to be just, hey Dad, I'm taking off the rest of the day, go follow this prophet guy. We know that it turned into more than that. Not that they would never return to fishing, but it would never be the same again. For much of their life would be devoted toward this effort to follow Jesus, to understand him, to encourage and support him, and then to follow him in ministry. And of the forementioned, 3 would indeed die violent deaths as a result of their decision to follow Jesus. The 4th, John, would end up in exile on some island in the Mediterranean. Didn't sound that terrible, but in exile, punishment, afraid for his life because of his decision to follow. And yet in the moment, it seems like a pretty impulsive decision to make. I can't imagine any of us being all that excited about any of our kids making an impulsive decision to walk away from the family and the family responsibility and their livelihood and just go off on some, what would certainly appear to us to be a whim. In fact, it would seem that the whole point of the message was what? Was it that these guys were such noble men? I don't think so. I think the point of the message is that Jesus was so completely convincing, so obviously with an authority that came from God, that they would not question. It didn't seem to cross their minds twice. He says, "Come follow," we say, "Yes, sir." He says, "Jump," we say, "How high?" It appears to be that clear to them that this was simply an invitation you accepted. Not too many of us experience that kind of invitation. Most of us, I suspect, just kind of grew up with it being part of our lives. And there's a question of whether or not we really ever face that moment of decision. But it occurs to me that Jesus being such an authority and these guys making such an impulsive choice that I wanted to talk a little bit about a decision-making process today. Something that may or may not be enlightening to us in our personal lives, our family lives, our work lives, our church life, our community life. How do you make a decision? Well, so I decided to Google it. And when you Google how to make a decision, your first decision is which one of the 10,000 entries to read. Oh, here's the 5 easy steps to making a decision. Oh, here's the 6 clear steps to making a decision. Here's the 7 essential steps to making a decision. It's like, well, how many do I want to actually preach about? And how easy is it? And the one I came across just was obvious because it used an acronym, which I love acronyms, and it used the most appropriate acronym. It says, here are the 6 steps of DECIDE. DECIDE. Seems perfect, seems preachable. And so I copy it down, email it to Sally, and she and Alan put it on the screen. You know how much easier it is to decide to do something when someone else does most of the work? How much easier it is to decide to do something when it's someone else's money, someone else's time, someone else's effort. Right? How much easier it is to make a decision when it's someone else who has to do all the changing. I can decide what's wrong with my marriage. My wife just needs to change. What's wrong with the church? The world needs to change. But with their support, we offer to you these 6 steps to making a decision. Let's see how they work. The D stands for define the problem. Seems pretty straightforward, but it's amazing how many times we proceed without defining the problem. Or how many times we proceed having ill-defined problem. The second, establish the criteria, right? If I'm going to make a decision, I need to understand what are the limits. Hey, you know what? I could solve any church's problem. You just give me $100 million today.
No problem.
Well, can you do it on 1,500? Well, that's an interesting challenge. We can establish the criteria. You can do anything you want as long as you don't change worship. You can do anything you want as long as you don't ask us to try something different or new. Right? Come up with a solution that everybody approves of. What are the criteria? You're trying to solve a marital issue. What are the criteria? What are the limits? Okay, I'll go to marital counseling twice, as long as we don't have to pay for it. And it doesn't interfere with my basketball schedule this month. Versus, I'll do whatever it takes, anytime I'm needed to make this work. Criteria are important. How committed are we? What are the resources we have? What's the real limits? Consider all the alternatives. That's the most fun part of any meeting. Let's consider the things that we absolutely hate. It's amazing how many times the real answer is in something that we just don't want to consider. And it's amazing how much we can learn when we will simply open our minds enough to give it room. You know, why don't we want to consider this one? We'll learn a lot about ourselves. I know somebody that tried that once and it didn't work. Those of you who have ever experienced, I think knee surgery for me is the top one. I had a knee replacement. As soon as I told people I was going to have a knee replacement, you wouldn't believe how many people came out of the woodwork telling me how terrible the knee replacement surgery they had was. Meanwhile, the people who had really successful knee surgery are walking right past us all the time. Consider all the alternatives before we rule them out. In a quasi-theological sense, you never know who's going to be the voice of God today. Identify the best alternative. That in itself requires a process. How do we know what's best? But it certainly has to meet the criteria. It has to address the problem we define. Develop and implement a plan of action. A lot of times, in those marital problems or in those personal issues, we can get all the way to implement, and that's where we stop short. I've defined my problem. I'm having these symptoms. I've decided that what I need to do after I considered all the alternatives and established the criteria, that I need to go to the doctor to determine exactly what it is I'm dealing with. No, I don't think so. Implementing the plan is often the thing that separates success from inaction. Letting something go. Evaluate and monitor the solution. And truthfully, sometimes we're so busy solving one problem after the other that we never have a chance or never make the effort to evaluate. Hey, did that actually work? I don't know, I'm busy on the next one. Oh, there's no sense looking back. There's no sense evaluating. So, it seems like one of those reasonable step-by-step way to making a decision that probably more effort than a lot of us want to put into anything. But I really want to focus this morning on that first one. Define the problem, and problem may even be a problem. You know, sometimes the problem is some sort of conflict, some sort of dysfunction. All the roof's leaking. All the basement's flooding. Oh, my wife and I argue all the time, except when we're not in the same room. But sometimes it can be a problem like a mathematical problem. This is just an equation to solve. Think of it as define the challenge. Think of it as define the opportunity. In church life, thinking, define the identity, define the purpose, define the reason that we're all here. Before we launch off into all sorts of plans and schemes and ministries and activities and events, let's figure out why we're here to begin with. We can certainly keep ourselves really busy doing all sorts of things. But do they fit with the real identity and purpose that we have? And if they don't, at some point in time, I want to tell you, one of the hardest things in the life of a church is to look at something people like doing that don't contribute at all to their identity and purpose and stop doing it. I can't believe you want to stop doing that. But it doesn't have anything to do with why we're here and what we're doing. Yeah, well, we like it. It's a tradition. It's a good way to get fired. Define who we are. What is our purpose? And while it's certainly valid to have different answers, different nuances to those answers, I'm going to offer the most simple one I can come up with, based on our passage this morning, what Scripture says. Our purpose, our identity is to follow Jesus. We can argue all our lives about what that means. But it seems to me being a Christian church has to have something to do with Jesus. All kinds of people who don't have anything to do with Jesus do all kinds of wonderful things in the world. I'm not criticizing that. But being a Christian has to have something to do with Jesus. We're going to follow Jesus. And why even bother to say that is because so much of what Christianity has done in 2,000 years has been the exact opposite of everything you read in the Gospels about Jesus. It's amazing how human beings get twisted so easily. It's not amazing that people become committed and devoted and they make impulsive decisions to follow and they actually do things. What's amazing are the things that they'll commit to. Right? January in Green Bay, guys with shorts and painted green, sitting in sub-zero temperatures watching a football game, you know? Still waiting for intelligence to arrive on the planet. It's devotion and commitment are not the impressive thing. It's making sure we define who we are. Making sure that we're following the Jesus who called us. To establish what are his priorities. What did we hear from him? What did we see from him? And much of what happens in the Christian world, and the denominations and the congregations and the individuals, has nothing at all to do with who he was and what he taught. And some of the most devoted, sacrificial people on the planet follow something they think is Jesus. I guess it's not our place to judge them. I learned that from Jesus. It is our place to make judgments for ourselves, to make sure we know who Jesus is. And it's no longer sufficient as adults for us to just do it because it's what Grandma taught us. Or it's because of what our Sunday school teacher said. Or it's because it's what we've always done. It is our task, our responsibility, as we make our own decisions, to know for ourselves. Not to be afraid of acknowledging that we have something left to learn. Not to be afraid to become aware of the fact that I may have mistakenly headed down one path for quite a while. Not to be afraid to confess. I spent most of my life not really caring. I wasn't necessarily in the wilderness. I was off on a vacation from being responsible. But it seems, from what I've seen in Jesus, that God wants our lives to count. I think one of the best phrases I've heard in the last 20 years. God wants us to live our life on purpose. So what is that purpose? What does it mean for you to follow Jesus? What is the next step? How do you correct the path you're on? How do you find the courage and inspiration, wisdom, strength to take a breath, make a decision, and move? Let us pray. So much easier, oh God, when someone else makes decisions for us, then we just get to complain. So much harder to be an adult, to take responsibility, to be willing to learn, to be willing to admit mistakes and failures, to be willing to face our fears. But it's so much easier when we do it with you. When you walk by our side and we walk by yours, and we simply face what we have to face. So much easier, oh God, when we're surrounded by people who love us, like the people here in this room. So much easier when we discover that they still love us after they know the truth about us. So much simpler, oh God, when we quit hiding the truth and pretending. We simply come before you as your beloved child. So keep loving us, O God, and help us to face the challenge, to climb the mountain, to navigate the waters, to trust in you and to move forward in faith. In Jesus' name.